There's a specific moment that changes an empath permanently, and it isn't the moment they discover a lie or catch a contradiction or find evidence of something they suspected all along. Those moments feel significant, but they rarely change anything by themselves because an empath in love has an almost limitless capacity to explain away evidence, to build a more generous story around it, to keep believing in the version of someone they fell in love with, even when the facts stop supporting it. No, the real turning point is quieter than that, and far more devastating in a way that has nothing to do with anger. It's the moment an empath finally looks directly at what they've been calling love and sees with total clarity that it was never love at all. It was need, dressed carefully in love's clothing, worn so convincingly that even the person wearing it may have believed the costume was real. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be honest with you from the start. This isn't a comfortable topic. Seeing through this kind of love doesn't feel like liberation in the moment it happens. It feels like grief, layered on top of grief, because you're not just losing a relationship, you're losing a version of reality you built your emotional life around, sometimes for years. But by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this moment of seeing clearly, however painful, is the single most important turning point available to anyone who has lived inside this particular kind of confusion. Let's start with something that needs to be said plainly, because it rarely gets said with enough honesty in conversations about narcissistic relationships. Narcissists are often genuinely convincing when they perform love, and this isn't always a calculated act of deception in the way people imagine. Many narcissists don't experience themselves as pretending. They experience intense longing, real excitement, even something that feels internally indistinguishable from love, especially in the early stages of a relationship. The problem isn't that the feeling is entirely fake. The problem is what that feeling is actually oriented toward, and what happens to it once the initial conditions that produced it change. For most people, love is oriented toward another person's well-being, even when that well-being occasionally conflicts with their own preferences. It includes curiosity about who someone actually is, not just who they appear to be in the moments that feel good. For a narcissist, what gets called love is frequently oriented toward something else entirely, the specific feeling of being adored, admired, or needed by another person. The empath isn't loved as a distinct individual with their own inner world. They're loved as a source, a mirror, an audience whose attention produces a feeling the narcissist has learned to chase and depend on. This distinction sounds subtle when stated this way, but it produces two relationships that look almost identical on the surface and function in completely opposite ways underneath. This is why the early stages of these relationships are so often intoxicating, and why empaths so rarely see anything wrong until much later. In the beginning, when the narcissist's need for admiration and the empath's capacity for deep attention align, the result can feel like the most powerful connection either person has ever experienced. The narcissist showers attention on the empath because that attention is currently producing the exact feeling they crave, being the center of someone's devoted focus. The empath, meanwhile, experiences this intensity as proof of exceptional compatibility, as evidence that they've finally found someone capable of matching their own depth of feeling. Both people are having a real experience. They're just having entirely different experiences of the same relationship, and neither one realizes it yet. Here's where the pattern starts to reveal itself, though, because this initial alignment isn't stable, and it was never going to be. The narcissist's need for admiration doesn't diminish once the relationship becomes established. If anything, it often intensifies, because established relationships require ongoing effort to maintain, and effort is precisely what stops feeling exciting once uncertainty is removed. Meanwhile, the empath's attention, which was initially poured out freely because it felt reciprocated, begins to be redirected toward managing the relationship itself. Soothing insecurities, interpreting mixed signals, absorbing moods that shift, without clear explanation. The empath doesn't consciously decide to take on this role. It happens gradually, one small accommodation at a time, until an entire relationship's emotional infrastructure is being maintained by one person, while the other simply continues receiving what that infrastructure provides. This is the part that deserves real attention because it explains something confusing that almost every empath in this situation experiences: the persistent, nagging feeling that something is wrong, paired with an equally persistent inability to identify exactly what. This confusion isn't a failure of perception. It's the direct result of genuinely conflicting evidence. There are real moments of warmth, real instances of what looks like deep understanding, real declarations that sound sincere in the moment they're spoken. These moments aren't fabricated out of nothing. They're often genuine expressions of whatever the narcissist is capable of feeling in that particular instant. But they exist alongside a pattern of behavior that consistently prioritizes the narcissist's emotional needs over the empath's, a pattern so consistent that it eventually becomes the relationship's actual structure, even while individual moments continue to suggest otherwise. An empath trying to reconcile these two realities, the warm moments and the consistent pattern underneath them, often ends up doing something psychologically exhausting without realizing it, treating the warm moments as the truth of the relationship and the consistent pattern as an unfortunate deviation from that truth rather than the other way around. This reversal is understandable. Warm moments feel like connection, and connection feels true in a way that patterns, which require distance and analysis to even notice, simply don't feel in the moment. But this reversal is also precisely what keeps an empath locked in confusion for far longer than the evidence should actually allow, because they keep waiting for the pattern to become the exception and the warmth to become the rule, when in reality, the relationship has always been operating the other way around. Let's talk about a specific dynamic that illustrates this confusion clearly because it plays out with remarkable consistency across different relationships, different people, different specific circumstances. Picture an empath who has just gone through a difficult, hurtful interaction. Perhaps the narcissist said something dismissive or disappeared for a stretch without explanation, or reacted to a legitimate concern with irritation instead of understanding. In the aftermath of this hurt, something unexpected happens. The narcissist becomes unusually affectionate, unusually attentive, offering exactly the kind of warmth the empath has been quietly craving throughout the relationship. This warmth feels enormous precisely because of the contrast it follows, and the empath, starved for exactly this kind of attention, often experiences it as proof that the real relationship, the one worth staying for, still exists underneath the difficulty. What's actually happening here, though, is something the empath usually can't see clearly until much later. The warmth isn't a return to normal after a difficult deviation. The warmth is functioning as a repair mechanism specifically designed, whether consciously or not, to restore the empath's emotional investment after it's been threatened by hurt or doubt. This is precisely why the timing of these warm moments so often follows periods of conflict or distance rather than occurring randomly throughout the relationship. They're not independent expressions of affection. They're responses to a specific threat, the risk that the empath might start pulling away permanently, taking with them the attention and admiration the narcissist has come to depend on. Once you understand this mechanism, a painful but clarifying realization starts to take shape, one that we'll spend the rest of this exploration unpacking fully. The empath hasn't simply misread the relationship. They've been responding entirely reasonably to a system specifically engineered, even if unintentionally, to produce exactly the responses it needs to sustain itself. The warmth wasn't random generosity, it was maintenance. And understanding the difference between these two things, genuine care freely given and strategic warmth deployed specifically to prevent loss, is the beginning of the empath finally being able to see the entire relationship clearly, not through the distorted lens of individual moments, but through the honest shape of the pattern those moments have always been quietly serving. Now that we understand warmth can function as maintenance rather than genuine connection, we need to go deeper into a question most empaths eventually ask themselves, usually with a kind of desperate confusion. If it wasn't real love, then what exactly was I experiencing during all those moments that felt so undeniably true? This question deserves a real answer because dismissing those moments entirely, calling them simply fake or manipulative, doesn't actually match the lived experience of what happened, and pretending it does only creates a different kind of confusion to replace the original one. Here's a more accurate way to understand it. What the empath experienced during those moments was often a genuine emotional state in the narcissist, dear, just not the emotional state the empath assumed it was. When a narcissist expresses what looks like deep love, deep vulnerability, deep connection, there's frequently something real happening internally. But what's real is usually closer to relief or gratitude or a temporary quieting of insecurity, rather than the sustained, other-oriented care that love actually requires to be love in the fullest sense. In that specific moment, the narcissist may genuinely feel something powerful toward the empath, because the empath's presence has just relieved an uncomfortable internal state. The mistake isn't in sensing that something real was happening. The mistake is in assuming that whatever was real in that moment represented a stable, ongoing truth about the relationship rather than a temporary reaction to a temporary internal shift. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why so many empaths describe these relationships using language like, "it felt so real," without contradiction. Even after they fully recognize the manipulation involved, both things can be true simultaneously. The feeling was real in the moment it occurred, and it was never a reliable foundation for an entire relationship because it was tied to the narcissist's internal state rather than to any consistent commitment toward the empath's well-being. Real feelings tethered to nothing but momentary internal relief don't accumulate into love. They simply repeat moment after moment without ever building into the kind of sustained care that could actually be trusted. This is where we need to talk about something rarely discussed with real precision: the specific role idealization plays in these dynamics and why it's so much more psychologically disorienting than simple flattery. Early in these relationships, and sometimes recurring throughout them, narcissists frequently engage in intense idealization of their partner, treating the empath as uniquely understanding, uniquely deep, uniquely capable of finally providing what no one else ever has. This isn't experienced by the empath as manipulation, because manipulation implies a kind of calculated falseness. And idealization rarely feels false from either side while it's happening. It feels like being truly seen, truly appreciated, truly valued in a way that's felt rare or absent in other relationships. But idealization operates on a mechanism that's fundamentally different from genuine appreciation, and understanding this mechanism is crucial to seeing through it. Genuine appreciation is built on accumulated knowledge of a person, their actual patterns, actual flaws, actual complexity integrated into a stable, realistic picture that includes both admiration and acceptance of imperfection. Idealization, by contrast, is built on projection. The narcissist isn't responding to the empath's actual complexity. They're responding to a version of the empath constructed specifically to fulfill an internal need, a version that's flattering to imagine loving because it reflects well on the person doing the idealizing. This is why idealization so often feels intoxicating in its intensity, and why it so often collapses without warning into disappointment or even hostility the moment the empath's actual complex humanity doesn't match the projected fantasy. This collapse, when it happens, is frequently misunderstood by empaths as something they caused, some failure to live up to what they were being offered. but it's worth understanding clearly. The collapse isn't a response to anything the empath actually did wrong. It's the inevitable result of a fantasy meeting reality, and reality, being complex and human, was never going to sustain a projection built to be flawless. This is one of the most painful and least discussed aspects of these relationships, the whiplash between being treated as extraordinary and being treated as a disappointment, often over the exact same underlying behavior, simply because the narcissist's internal need shifted from craving connection to craving distance, or from craving admiration to craving control. Let's talk about what actually happens in the empath's own psychology during this cycle of idealization and collapse, because it produces a very specific and rarely named internal experience: chronic self-monitoring. Once an empath has experienced enough of these swings, something shifts in how they relate to their own behavior within the relationship. They start constantly scanning their own words, their own reactions, their own choices, trying to identify which version of themselves produces the idealized response and which version triggers the disappointed one. This isn't vanity or insecurity in the ordinary sense. It's an adaptive response to an unpredictable environment, the same kind of hypervigilance that develops in any situation where the rules for safety keep shifting without clear explanation. This chronic self-monitoring is exhausting in a way that's difficult to fully convey to someone who hasn't experienced it, because it operates constantly beneath the surface of everyday interactions, consuming enormous amounts of emotional energy that never gets acknowledged or accounted for. And here's what makes it particularly insidious. This self-monitoring often gets mistaken by the empath themselves for evidence of how much they care about the relationship. The exhausting effort of managing their own behavior to avoid triggering disappointment feels like devotion, feels like proof of how invested they are, when it's actually a survival response to an environment that has quietly become unsafe in ways that are difficult to name directly, because nothing about it looks like danger in any conventional sense. Now let's bring this together with something crucial, because it explains exactly what seeing through this kind of love actually requires, and why it's so much harder than simply learning facts about narcissistic behavior. Seeing through this pattern isn't primarily an intellectual process. It's not enough to read about narcissism, recognize the textbook behaviors, and check the appropriate boxes. Because the confusion runs deeper than intellectual misunderstanding, it's embedded in the empath's own nervous system, in the exhausting habit of self-monitoring, in the genuine emotional memory of moments that really did feel real. Seeing through this love requires something more difficult: the willingness to hold two painful truths simultaneously without letting either one cancel out the other. The moments felt real, and the relationship was never actually safe. The narcissist likely did feel something powerful in those intense moments of connection, and that feeling was never stable enough to build an entire relationship's foundation on. Both of these things are true at the same time, and learning to hold them together without collapsing into either it was all fake or it must have been real love after all is the actual psychological work involved in finally seeing clearly. Let's start with what it actually looks like when an empath finally learns to hold both truths at once, because this is where the real transformation happens, and it's different from anything we've described so far in this story. Holding complexity doesn't mean staying neutral, and it doesn't mean forgiving indiscriminately just because some of what happened was genuinely felt. It means something more precise. The empath stops asking, "Was any of it real?" as if that question determines what they should do next, and starts asking a much more useful question instead. Was this something that could ever have become safe, sustainable, and mutual, regardless of what was real in any individual moment? That second question doesn't require solving the mystery of the narcissist's inner life. It only requires looking honestly at the pattern, and once an empath can ask that question without needing a comforting answer, something fundamental shifts in how they relate to the entire relationship. This shift changes the emotional weight of memory itself. And this is worth explaining clearly because it's one of the most underappreciated parts of healing from this kind of confusion. Before this shift, an empath's memories of the relationship tend to function like evidence in an ongoing trial, constantly being weighed against each other. Was he sincere that night or was he performing? Did she really mean it when she said, "I was the only one who understood her"? Or was that just what she needed to say in that moment? Every memory gets picked up, examined, and put back down unresolved because the empath is still trying to determine a verdict about whether the relationship was, at its core, love or manipulation, as if it has to be cleanly one or the other. Once complexity is genuinely accepted, this trial simply stops running. The memories don't need to be resolved anymore because their evidentiary weight has changed entirely. A tender moment can be remembered as tender without that tenderness needing to prove the entire relationship was healthy. A painful moment can be remembered as painful without needing to erase the tenderness that surrounded it. The memories become simply what they were, a complicated, uneven mixture of real feeling and real harm, occurring within a structure that consistently prioritized one person's needs over the other's. This isn't a downgrade of the empath's experience into something less meaningful. It's actually an upgrade into something far more accurate. And accuracy, it turns out, is what finally allows the nervous system to stop searching for a resolution that was never going to arrive. Here's the deepest insight this entire story has been building toward, and it's worth stating as clearly as possible because it's the thing that finally allows an empath to stop chasing certainty about someone else's inner life and start trusting their own experience instead. The question of whether the narcissist truly loved them was never actually the most important question available, even though it felt for a long time like the only one that mattered. The more important question, the one that actually determines what an empath does next, is much simpler. Was this a relationship where care flowed in both directions, consistently over time, in ways that could be relied upon? And once that question replaces the endless search for a verdict on someone else's sincerity, the answer becomes obvious almost immediately because it doesn't require reading anyone's mind. It only requires looking honestly at years of behavior, stripped of the hope that made that behavior so difficult to see clearly while it was happening. This is what it actually means to finally see through a narcissist's love. It isn't a moment of triumphant clarity where every warm memory gets recategorized as fake. It's something quieter and more mature than that. It's the recognition that love, real love, isn't defined by its most intense moments, however genuine those moments might have felt. It's defined by its consistency, its reliability, its willingness to prioritize another person's well-being, even when doing so requires effort, sacrifice, or discomfort. Measured by that standard, rather than by the standard of how intensely a feeling was expressed in any given instant, the relationship reveals its actual shape clearly, often for the first time. And that shape, once seen honestly, rarely resembles the story the empath had been telling themselves for years. What changes for the empath once they reach this understanding goes far beyond this one relationship, and this is where everything we've explored throughout this story finally comes together. They stop evaluating love by its intensity and start evaluating it by its consistency. They stop treating their own chronic self-monitoring as evidence of devotion and start recognizing it as a signal that something in the environment isn't safe. They stop needing a clean verdict about someone else's sincerity before they can trust their own experience of harm. And perhaps most importantly, they stop believing that their capacity to love deeply, to feel intensely, to hold space for someone else's complexity was ever the problem in the first place. It never was. The problem was never the size of their heart. It was the direction that heart kept getting pointed in, toward someone who experienced love as something to be extracted rather than something to be built together patiently over time, with both people showing up equally. This is the final understanding worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this story. Seeing through a narcissist's love doesn't mean deciding that love itself was an illusion, or that connection can't be trusted, or that vulnerability was a mistake. It means learning, often through considerable pain, what love actually requires in order to be real and sustainable, rather than simply intense. It requires two people, not one, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of showing up for each other consistently, especially in the moments that don't feel exciting or urgent. It requires safety that doesn't depend on constant self-monitoring to maintain. It requires warmth that isn't strategically timed to prevent someone from leaving, but freely given because another person's well-being genuinely matters, independent of what that person is currently providing in return. So if you've recognized your own story somewhere in everything we've explored today, let this be what you carry forward. The moment you finally saw through it wasn't the moment you stopped loving. It was the moment you finally understood what love was supposed to feel like and recognized with painful clarity that you had been settling for its performance instead. That recognition doesn't diminish your capacity for connection. It refines it. It doesn't mean you'll never trust again. It means the next time you do, you'll finally know the difference between being needed and being loved, between intensity and consistency, between a mirror that reflects someone else's hunger and a relationship built on two people actually seeing each other clearly. You spent a long time being someone's need disguised as someone's love. What you deserve and what you're now finally equipped to recognize is something far simpler and far more rare: to be loved exactly as steadily as you have always been willing to love in return.